All right, it's always an extremely exciting day, like the Academy Awards or the Pulitzers or the great awards that our society and our world gives out to people of high accomplishment, because today was the day that the Nobel Peace Prize was announced. I had difficulty sleeping throughout the week. I actually had to use a lot of CBD to try and calm myself down into sleep, knowing that this big day was coming. And the Nobel Peace Prize was announced this morning by the Nobel Committee based out of Norway. And the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, which is designed to recognize and celebrate the efforts of leaders to avert war and violence and conflict and instead usher in peace, is a woman named Maria Corina Machado, who is the leader of the opposition of Venezuela. Now, as a lot of you know, Venezuela is very much on the radar of the United States. It has always been for quite a long time because it's in our backyard, what the Monroe Doctrine considers to be our area of influence. Hugo Chavez, who was the leader that replaced pro-American, pro-oligarchical leaders because he was elected by the people of Venezuela, among whom he was quite popular, not all of them obviously, but a significant portion, especially the poorer people, the workers, was extremely defiant of the United States. Particularly insistent that Venezuela's massive oil supply be used at the direction of the Venezuelan government for the interest of the Venezuelan people and not for the United States. And as a result, Venezuela has been under suffocating sanctions, like Cuba has been for many, many years now, cutting off trade, preventing all kinds of ability to expand their economy, to do business dealings with American companies and the like, because they believe that Venezuela doesn't do America's bidding when it comes to opening up their markets and their resources to the ability of American companies to control and exploit what they want to do there. They think they become too close to China. So basically, they've been punished for their defiance. And so you have Hugo Chavez, whose legacy was cut short because he died of cancer, and his successor, Nicolas Maduro, who has now been in power many, many years. There's no question. They have authoritarian aspects to their country, no doubt about that, just like Cuba does. And I don't want to excuse it at all because I don't, but when you have the world's, history's most powerful military and most powerful economy and strongest country, threatening you constantly with regime change, suffocating your economy, any country is going to have to reduce basic freedoms because you're being threatened by external forces. That's what the United States has always done when it feels threatened by external forces during World War II, after 9/11. It's doing it now in the wake of perceptions of internal threats. And that's part of why Venezuela is authoritarian, but also the system itself is authoritarian. There's no denying that. But they're not any worse, and I would suggest not even close to being worse than all sorts of extremely close U.S. allies, like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, in Jordan, in the Emiratis, in Qatar, to say nothing of all the governments we've engineered regime change in order to impose, including in that region. So if you live in the region, as I have and do, nobody takes seriously the notion that the United States government is offended by tyranny or dictatorship. That's not why we're angry at Venezuela. That's not why we're interested in Venezuela. That's not why the United States is openly, under Marco Rubio, engineering what has long been one of his dreams, what the people he represents in Florida are hoping to do. Many of them come from Venezuela, have fled Venezuela, which is engineer regime change in Venezuela, the way the United States has long wanted to do in Cuba. And now they're bombing boats off the coast of Venezuela with the obvious pretext of convincing you it's necessary to prevent drugs from coming to the United States, and calling Maduro a narco-terrorist to justify using the war on terror framework and the war on drug framework, what is clearly intended to be an imminent military-style attempt to change the government of Venezuela, the kind of regime change wars that Trump and many people close to him swore were destroying America and would never do again. Seems like it's imminent in Venezuela. And we've been wanting to do regime change there forever, under Democrats and Republicans. For whatever reason, they decided that Juan Guaido was the real president of Venezuela. Our media called him president of Venezuela. When he came to the United States and parts of Europe, he was given official state treatments. The president, the real president of Venezuela, I remember when Trump in his first term, he was at President Trump's first State of the Union address. And sitting behind Trump, of course, was his Vice President Mike Pence and also the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And when Trump said, and we have with us the true and legitimate president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, he stood up, both parties stood up. Nancy Pelosi jumped up in a standing ovation faster than I've ever seen her move. And it was a very bipartisan idea that we pick the government of Venezuela. That it's for us to not only choose, but then to impose our will there. And there was an attempt with John Bolton and others in the first Trump term to actually overthrow Maduro using our traditional means of covert operations and military force. And Trump got frustrated with John Bolton when it wasn't nearly as easy as Bolton assured him it would be. And that's part of what led to their separation. And by the way, it seems like John Bolton is going to be arrested. You may remember there was an FBI raid on his house about a month ago. And there's reports that he is close to being indicted and arrested maybe within the next week. So there's always some good news on the horizon if you look for it hard enough. But that idea of regime change in Venezuela is something the United States has always wanted to do. And clearly the Trump administration has rapidly prioritized it. To the point that we're now bombing there, even though Congress hasn't authorized it. We're threatening overtly to bomb inside Venezuela. And again, the pretext is that that's where drugs come from that kill our communities, when in reality, as we've shown you, government reports acknowledge that a tiny percentage of the drugs that enter the United States actually come from Venezuela. If you actually wanted to stem the tide of drugs entering the United States, one of the most wasteful and ineffective things you could do is have some kind of quasi-war, or if not quasi, an outright war with Venezuela to change the government. That's one of the least likely ways to stem the tide of drugs entering the United States. That's an obvious pretext. There's a lot of other reasons why the United States wants to change the government of Venezuela. And so here you have the Nobel Peace Prize Committee deciding right as the United States and other countries want to engineer regime change. They're being very open about that. They want to elevate the woman who is the face of the opposition to the government that we want to overthrow as some sort of world historic figure of peace and humanitarianism. And so Maria Corina Machado is the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize for 2025. And I have to say, a lot of people dislike Maduro, think he's a dictator, think he's immiserated the Venezuelan population. You can think that all you want. Like I said, there's a lot of dictators in the world, many that the United States loves. And you can even think she's a brave dissident. And I would actually say there's been bravery on her part. But it's also worth remembering that she is hardly an organic force inside Venezuela. She's somebody who the United States, just like they did with Juan Guaido, has spent many, many millions of dollars pouring into NGOs in Venezuela to prop her up, to fund and fuel anti-Maduro agitations and protests like we've done in so many countries, including Russia and many others. We're very involved in that, and she is very much tied to the United States. She's somebody who the United States adores. In fact, it was Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, Trump's national security advisor and his Secretary of State, who actually nominated her to win the Nobel Peace Prize and wrote the letters that recommended her. That's how she got onto the list of the nominees. And this is very much a US-backed figure, and elevating her to this prize, with this prize, right as the United States wants to justify the regime change in Venezuela with a regime change war, some covert or quasi-war, seems, to put it mildly, uncoincidental. At the very least, giving her this award will fuel and strengthen whatever Washington decides to do in terms of engineering regime change in Venezuela, now that the person who would ascend to the presidency is somebody not only who's very pro-Washington, pro-West, pro-US, but also is now a Nobel laureate for peace. And like I said, you can hate Maduro as much as you want, love her as much as you want. I have a hard time answering the question, like, what is it that she has done in the name of peace? Where did she bring peace to a conflict? Where did she usher in peace or nonviolence? How has she become, has she been somebody who usually goes to people who have resolved major conflicts? Like the iconic ones are Nelson Mandela and Frederick de Klerk, who, after Mandela got out of prison, there was a big potential for civil war in South Africa, and only because of their leadership. where they told their respective sides we're going to be peaceful and a transition of power. That's what the Nobel Peace Prize is for. People who resolve conflicts, resolve wars, avert conflict that can be militarily dangerous, and bring about peace. So even if you like her, admire what she's done, I still don't understand how that relates to the Nobel Peace Prize. So we got a lot of questions on this as well today. The one from Go Birds is representative. Hi, Glenn. What do you think about the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to Maria Corina Machado? It seems weird that every establishment outlet seems to be cheering on her receiving this award, especially as the Trump administration has been pushing for regime change in Venezuela. Does the Nobel Peace Prize even mean anything anymore? And it's actually interesting because if you look at the Nobel Peace Prize over the last, say, 20 years, a very clear pattern emerges. And this is, I think, one of the most overlooked aspects of Western discourse and of the propaganda to which we're all subjected as Western citizens and citizens of the United States, which is we're constantly being told that civil rights abuses are the thing we fight against, or the thing that motivates us to enter into the world stage, to free people from all kinds of tyranny and repression. I mean, that was ultimately, in addition to WMD, the justification for the Iraq War. We're going to free the Iraqi people from the repression of Saddam Hussein. I remember Tony Blair saying, look, even if it turns out there's no weapons of mass destruction there, the worst thing that can be said about our war is that we freed Iraq from one of the worst monsters on the planet. As if the United States and its allies go to war to fight against tyrannies. The United States spends at least as much time installing tyrannies and funding them and propping them up as it does combating them. Same thing in Ukraine. Oh, we're in Ukraine because Ukraine's a democracy. We love democracies. We're fighting against Putin's tyranny. And you look at who U.S. allies have always been since the end of World War II. Supporting tyranny, supporting despotism has been a central plank, a staple of U.S. foreign policy in post-World War II. We want to keep various areas stable, and we want to keep public opinion repressed by imposing on those countries, not the democratically leaders they selected, but the dictators who are our puppets. Iran is a great example, many in Latin America, Indonesia, all over the place. And we still do that. We have an Egyptian puppet who got installed by the United States, Sisi, General Sisi, because the Egyptian people finally won the right to vote, but they voted for the wrong candidate, Mohamed Morsi, who the West disliked. He was overthrown with our help, and now there's a dictatorship. That's what the United States does. So we're not interested in Venezuela because we're against oppression. But what you'll see is how weaponized human rights discourse and the language of oppression is weaponized so constantly in American media. You will hear far, far, far more about the human rights abuses of America's adversaries than you will about America's allies, even if the American allies are infinitely worse in terms of their human rights abuses than the ones of the American enemies. As I said, you don't hear very much about Saudi repression. You certainly don't hear about Emirati oppression or Egyptian oppression or Qatari oppression. I'm not saying you can't find it if you look for it. We're just not bombarded with it. We're not. Our emotions aren't provoked over it because we like those governments. They do our bidding. We want them in place. So there's no campaign to convince the American people, oh, this is some monstrous evil dictator. Saddam Hussein was our partner. We never cared that he gassed his own people when he attacked the Kurds. That only became something that morally outraged us when it was time to demonize Saddam Hussein and we were intended to go to war. This is probably one of the things that I think is most important to realize in terms of how we're propagandized through this kind of selective human rights indignation. And as a result, we hear all the time about the evils of Maduro, even though his evils, whatever they might be, are far less than the evils of countless numbers of American allies about which we hear relatively very little. And so huge numbers of people are celebrating, yeah, Maduro's a bad guy, he does this, he does that, as though this is some kind of principle that we go around the world combating, as opposed to a pretext for the wars and interference and regime change we want to impose. And showering her with this award is part of promoting that narrative that it happens to be very useful right now to Trump and other allies in terms of overthrowing the government of Venezuela. Here is the winner herself, Maria Corina Machado, knowing exactly what this award is for and wasting no time saying exactly the things she needs to say to get what she wants, which is U.S. involvement in her country in an attempt to overthrow Maduro not by the Venezuelan people, by the United States, so that she gets empowered. Here's what she said, quote, "This recognition of the Nobel Peace Prize is really of the struggle of all Venezuelans and is a boost to conclude our task to conquer freedom. We are on the threshold of victory, and today, more than ever, we count on President Trump, the people of the United States, the peoples of Latin America, and the democratic nations of the world as our principal allies to achieve freedom and democracy. I dedicate this prize to the suffering people of Venezuela and to President Trump for his decisive cause for our support for our cause." This is somebody who has been urging sanctions be imposed on her own country by the United States and other outside forces. Somebody who has been urging military intervention, the use of the U.S. military in her own country to help her achieve her political goals. Again, you can call that justified, courageous, noble, but how is that represented the values of the Nobel Peace Prize? And there's now a long list of recipients of this Nobel Peace Prize who basically are dissidents, not of the governments that are allied with us and who are tyranny. They rarely, if ever, win. The people who win are the dissidents to the governments we want to demonize, to the ones that don't do our bidding. So in October of 2023, as the CNN headline indicates, the Nobel Peace Prize is won by Narges Mohammadi for the fight against the oppression of women in Iran. There was no Nobel Peace Prize winner for people fighting against the oppression of women in Saudi Arabia or parts of Africa or Qatar, even though this repression is just as bad because we don't have any interest in demonizing that government. Do you see how this is being weaponized, human rights discourse? Do you think the United States cares about human rights in reality as opposed to making that a pretext to advancing our goals? Here from Time Magazine, this was the prize given in 2021, why Dmitry Muratov's Nobel Peace Prize matters for Russia's journalist. Muratov is the founder and editor-in-chief of Novaya Gazeta, one of Russia's last big newspapers to regularly criticize President Vladimir Putin, and which has reported extensively on government corruption in the country. Quote, "The newspaper's fact-based journalism and professional integrity have made it an important source of information on sensible aspects of Russian society, rarely mentioned by other media," the Nobel Committee said in a statement announcing the award Friday. I'm not saying these people aren't doing noble work. Anybody who stands up to a repressive regime in their own country is somebody who deserves to be celebrated. I'm noting instead the very transparent selectivity of the Nobel Prize and the way in which it's designed to elevate the dissidents of the governments we want to weaken and demonize for our own purposes. It's a Western award given out with a clear agenda. And the Venezuelan example probably is the most brazen yet, though there are a lot of other ones. Here's another one from the New Yorker, October 8th, 2010. Li Xiaobo wins the Nobel Peace Prize. Liu, the literary critic and political essayist, was awarded for the Nobel Peace Prize on Friday for his long and nonviolent struggle for fundamental human rights in China. Again, nothing against these people who won, although I think it's odd to give a Nobel Peace Prize to somebody who's funded by many millions of dollars coming from the United States for NGOs against the government inside our own country who calls for military intervention in our own country. That's not very peaceful. But nothing against these people, that's not the point. The point is there's a clear narrative benefit to how these awards are chosen and whose narrative and whose interests are being promoted. So these Q&As are typically, I get asked questions by our audience, and I think it's a little imbalanced just because you're asking me questions doesn't mean I have no right to ask you questions. So I actually have a question for you now, and my question is this. You know those nights when you just don't sleep and the next day you're like draggy and exhausted and everything just feels harder? That's where CBD from CB Distillery can make a real difference, but it's not just sleep. CB Distillery has solutions that work with your body to help with stress, pain after exercise, even mood and focus. And it's all made with the highest quality, clean ingredients, no fillers, just premium CBD. Imagine waking up rested or enjoying your day without those nagging aches and pains. That's the real win of CB Distillery's solutions. That's why over 2 million people trust CB Distillery. I've talked many times before about how I used to have a bathroom cabinet filled with all kinds of prescriptions, like most people throughout the West do. And I was able to clear out so many of them, just be free of any kind of dependency on products with CBD. It just is a natural solution to help you sleep, to kind of ease stress. I've talked before about the kind of like nagging pain that you get when you play sports, when you work out. It really helps with that as well. So if you're ready for better sleep or less stress and feeling good in your own skin again, try CBD from CB Distillery. And right now, you can save 25% off your entire purchase. Visit CB Distillery and use the promo code GLENN. That's cbdistillery.com, promo code GLENN. cbdistillery.com. Specific product availability depends on individual state regulations. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.